What's up YouTube, BizMathy here, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to talk about how to wholesale foreclosed properties or how to assign non-assignable contracts. So this video, I'm not only going to specifically talk about foreclosed properties, but how to wholesale these properties that a lot of YouTubers and people in the real estate wholesaling genre always told you to avoid these type of properties because you just can't wholesale it. And so in today's video, we're going to talk about a specific method on what you can do in order to still wholesale these sort of properties. The main example I'm going to be talking about are foreclosed properties. And we're going to talk about kind of the history behind why we can't wholesale foreclosed properties. And then we'll talk about a method on what we can do to wholesale these type of properties and the pros and cons with this specific method. And by the way, all of this is coming from inspiration from a Forbes article I read recently on wholesaling non-assignable contract. By the author of this article is an investor and a hard money lender to a lot of wholesalers. And so he saw this practice being done among us wholesalers. And so he spoke about it or wrote about it in an article. And I just wanted to put it out in video format so you all can learn and that I also can implement in my business. Be sure to like this video, subscribe, and comment down below if you have any questions. All right, first, let me briefly talk about the history around wholesaling foreclosed property. So actually back in the day, you all, we as wholesalers actually wholesaled foreclosed property. We would still use an assignable contract. We'll put a property under contract with the bank that they had in foreclosure, and we would just assign that to another investors. But over time, banks started to notice this and they saw that investors were making way more money than the price of the actual home. So if the banks see that an investor buys their properties and then sells it for a higher price, it indicates to the banks that they're not getting full market value for their house. And that didn't really sit well with them. So when the 2008 housing market crash happened, banks started to enforce stricter rules about their foreclosed properties. And one of those rules were a lot of banks now do not allow contracts to be assignable whenever they're selling a house, whether it's in foreclosure or not in foreclosures. They don't allow assignable contracts usually. And so what can we do? What is this method that we can learn to assign non-assignable contracts? For example, foreclosure. So this investor said he ran into a lot of wholesalers doing something that's called transfer of LLC. And essentially, instead of assigning a property, a foreclosed home, to another investors, what wholesalers do, they transfer an LLC for a fee. So let me break this down a little bit more for you all. So let's say I buy a property, or I go to the courthouse, or I see a property on auction.com and it's $100,000, but I can't assign that property because the bank will not allow that. So what I would do, I would create a brand new LLC and I would put that property under contract with that brand new LLC. And essentially, I'm just selling that LLC to my end buyer. I'm selling my company. And now that the end buyer owns that LLC, they are obligated to buy that property, which they want to do, right? They want to get that property. But when I sell that LLC, I'm obviously charging a fee for transferring that LLC or just selling that LLC to my end buyer. I hope that makes sense. So essentially, you have an LLC and you transfer it over to an end buyer for a fee. Some things to consider with that is that in your operating agreement, when you're making this LLC, you have to make sure it includes clauses that you can transfer this LLC, and it also includes all contracts, all assets, and all obligation in this specific LLC. Another thing to consider with this method of transferring your LLC, you have to make sure that this LLC is completely brand new. This LLC cannot have any prior business activity because a buyer is not going to buy an LLC that has history usually, especially if it's history that's unknown to them. You know, it has to show that it's brand new, and it just makes the process so much more easier. There's not a lot of transferring of other assets that this LLC may have had if it had a prior business history. So you have to make sure this LLC is brand new. Another thing to consider, just like with all wholesale deals, you have to make sure your end buyer is paying with cash, right? So usually with a hard money loan or a private money lender or their own cash. So just like a regular wholesale deal, they have to buy in cash. So that's why it's imperative to know beforehand, before you even transfer this LLC, that the buyer knows they're buying this property for cash. So by the way, you all let me know about this transfer of LLC. What do you all think about it? Before I talk about the pros and cons down below, let me know. But the pros and cons, obviously a big pro to this is that you get to get deals that other wholesalers try to avoid, right? So that gives you a competitive advantage over other wholesalers who usually try to avoid these type of deals. And you get to make way more money because usually with foreclosed properties, they are at a significant discount. And especially now, the government will now allow more and more banks to foreclose on these properties now that this whole pandemic is starting to, it's not even starting to decrease, but banks are now allowing evictions and different things like that. It's making it possible now for banks to foreclose on these properties. So that opens the floodgates for us wholesalers to be able to still profit from these type of deals than other wholesalers. Another pro to this obviously is that when you're buying this or you're under contract with this property, you don't have to close on this property. So you don't have to incur any closing costs. Let's say you do have this LLC and you close it on yourself, you still have to pay like any fees or title searches that may have been included in the closing costs. You all get to avoid that and get to retain more of the profit. So now let's talk a little bit about the cons. So one of the cons that was mentioned in this article was that you have to create an LLC, and creating an LLC usually costs money. So that's just a little bit more cost than if you would just do a regular assignment on contract, right? And so different states have different prices for forming an LLC. I know here in Tennessee may be a different price than in Georgia. So that's just something you will have to consider when you want to do this transfer of LLC. Another con that could arise is that you may have to open a bank account if you want to do this transfer of LLC. So let's say you find an end buyer and they write you a check in that LLC's name, you obviously have to cash it in that LLC bank, right? If they don't write it in your personal name or another LLC that you have a bank with, you have to create a bank with that LLC. So that's another thing to consider. Another thing, a con to consider, is that just like in any wholesale deal, this deal still may fall apart, even if you have a buyer ready in place. Or let's say you're a beginner and you just didn't run your numbers right and the buyer backs out, or you can't find a buyer, you're still legally obligated to close on this deal. And if you're just not in the position to close on it, you leave the bank, mad at you and the seller mad at you, and you're not providing value to your sellers or just to the community in general in this business. So you have to be very careful. You have to really make sure you have your buyer in place if you want to do this method of transferring the LLC. So I hope you all enjoyed this video. I know I certainly learned a lot from reading this article. So if you all are interested, I'll put a link down below to this article so you all can read for yourself. But let me know, are you all going to start implementing this method in your wholesaling business? Let me know down below. All right, you all, hope you all have a great day. Be sure to like this video, subscribe, and I'll talk to you all later. Peace.